People hate kleptomaniacs. I mean, who in their right mind would enjoy getting their stuff stolen? For most humans, stealing all the time is either a crime out of desperation or a mental health condition, which is still a crime if you actually do the stealing, of course. In the greater animal kingdom, though, stealing all the time is not exactly a unique strategy. There is a term called kleptoparasitism, which is a form of eating behavior in which an animal steals food from other individuals, most of the time from other species. It could be more effective and efficient because hunting for prey itself is more difficult. Then there is a term called kleptogamy, where a quote-unquote weaker male will sneakily mate with a female behind the alpha male's back. Not literally behind its back, of course. That would be too risky and kinda insane. Those two are relatively known phenomena by the public. But those are not the topic of this video. This video will be talking about a different kind of klepto, where a group of animals, most likely female, will steal the opposite gamete from another species to proliferate. So yeah, there are some female-only animal groups that will steal sperms from other species to reproduce. That kind of animal group is called klepton. And now the question is, how exactly are they doing that? What do I mean by stealing sperms? How is that even sustainable? Well, let me bring up the question. What exactly is klepton? So let's just answer the question straight away, which, to be fair, I kinda already did. The occurrence where individuals of a species steal the opposite gamete from another species is called kleptogenesis, and the species that does that is called klepton. Well, actually, it's not necessarily a species, but we'll talk about that later. Klepto basically means to steal, and genesis basically means creation, or origin, or something like that. So the term basically means creation via stealing. The term was first proposed back in 1982, together with the term klepton and another term called synklepton. Klepton is the one doing the kleptogenesis, while synklepton is a group of species that live in the same area, aka sympatric, which typically consists of multiple quote-unquote normal species and at least one klepton. There are three ways of how a kleptogenesis could occur mechanically. First, the stolen sperm could trigger the division of egg cells, but the genetic material of said sperm is not incorporated. Hence, the offsprings are basically clones of the mother. Second, the quote-unquote stolen genetic materials could be incorporated without acquisition of the klepton's genetic material, forming polyploid individuals. To put it simply, the genetic material of the klepton is conserved, but extra genetic material from the stolen gamete is added on top of it. Then the third, the klepton can replace some of its genetic material by using the stolen gamete's genetic material. In the later two, the offsprings wouldn't be a perfect clone of its parent. Kleptons themselves can be categorized into three types based on how the kleptogenesis happens. Zygokleptons are kleptons that go through gamete fertilization, which would be hybridogenesis. Gynokleptons are kleptons that does not go through gamete fertilization, so the gamete from the stolen sperm is discarded, like I mentioned earlier, which is called gynogenesis. And then there are tychokleptons, which are the combinations of those two. And now the question is, how do they do it exactly? I mentioned stolen sperms, or at least stolen gametes, quite a lot already. But how exactly are these animals stealing those gametes? Well, let's talk about some real examples of kleptons. I would also like to discuss the problems and limitations surrounding kleptons and kleptogenesis. But I think what I'll discuss would make a lot more sense after we talk about some real examples of kleptons. So let's do it. Let's start with the most classic example of kleptogenesis, the Ambystoma klepton complex. 5 species are involved in this complex, which are Ambystoma tigrinum, Ambystoma barberi, Ambystoma texanum, Ambystoma jeffersonianum, and Ambystoma laterale. But hold on a second. Some of you might realize that the species that I mentioned are just, regular species. But no, the klepton is none of those species. The klepton is, well, to put it very simply, it's a separate group of Ambystoma. In the past, we assigned specific species to said kleptons. But nowadays, as we learn even more about them, the complex is, well, even more complex than we thought, and we couldn't exactly assign a specific species to these kleptons. We simply called them the unisexual Ambystoma complex. Unisexual because all of them are females. They could have the genes from the combination of those 5 species I mentioned, and not necessarily diploid. For example, in one individual, it could have 2 sets of Ambystoma jeffersonianum gene and 1 set of Ambystoma lateralis gene, hence LJJ. Oh, by the way, we initially thought they were gynogens, which would explain why all of them are females. But no, they are not clones. Their genetic materials are distinct from each other. When their phylogenetic relationship was analyzed, all of these kleptons grouped together, with their closest relative being the Ambystoma barberi from western Kentucky. This complex is most likely the oldest unisexual vertebrate, at least the ones that we know. Okay, so it should be obvious because it's the topic of this video, but yes, even though they are all female, they could survive and persist as a group because they steal sperms from those 5 species that I mentioned earlier. Hence, kleptogenesis. But the question is, how do they steal sperm exactly? Well, quite simple actually. Most male salamanders deposit sperm package called spermatophore, in which the female could take if they are interested. And now you should get it. These all-female individuals simply take the spermatophores that a male from other species deposit. Quite simple really. There are other examples of kleptons, and the next one might take longer to explain compared to this one. So before that, now let's talk about the hybridogenic water frogs, also known as the European green frog complex. First, let's take a look at this frog. This is called edible frog because they are often eaten by the French, and also Germans and Italians, I suppose. In the past, we knew them as Rana esculenta, and then it got revised into Pelophylax esculentus, but still, just another frog species among the ones we know basically. But now, we know that edible frogs are actually hybrids. The hybridization between Pelophylax lessonae and Pelophylax ridibundus. So it's not their own species. Okay, so you might think that's not exactly special. There are various hybrids in the world. I'm sure you know liger at least, or perhaps mule, that's a hybrid. But let me remind you, those are artificially created hybrids. By that I mean, we, humans, specifically tried to breed different species to create such hybrid. And as you might already know, in a hybrid, either all of them are practically sterile, or only one of the sexes is fertile. And so, a hybrid typically cannot persist by themselves, especially in the wild. Hybrids do occur naturally, but the same rule typically applies. Either all sterile or only one of the sexes is fertile. Hence, even if hybrids occur, it will not persist as a group. Unless we're talking about plants, of course, that's a whole nother topic, but this is a zoology channel, so we're not gonna talk about those. But then, as I said, we are familiar with the edible frog, they persist, and we even thought it's an actual species by classic definition. So, how could that be? Well, they are kleptons. We observed 3 systems in this complex, depends on where they could be found. Different populations, basically. Let's talk about the most studied one first, the LE system. Oh, by the way, we will be using the letters L, R, and E a lot from now on, so let me make it clear. L refers to lessonae, R refers to ridibundus, while E refers to esculentus. So LE system means esculentus, which is our klepton in this example, will need to mate with lessonae to produce even more esculentus. But how so? And why? Well, normally, when a gamete is produced, a genetic recombination will occur. So imagine this is the gene from your mother and this is from your father. When you are about to form a gamete, these two will recombine. Hence, when this chromosome is divided into gamete, it will not be the exact same gametes as your parents. Again, that's what normally happens. But what happened for these hybrid frogs is, when an esculentus produces gametes, there is no recombination. So each of the parents' gene is technically conserved. And then what happened is, the gene from Lesone is discarded. Hence, an Esculentus will always pass Ridibundus gene when they reproduce. And so, if they reproduce with Lesone, which will always pass Lesone gene of course, then what always happens is the combination of L gene and R gene. Hence, Esculentus. So, what happens if an Esculentus mate with a Ridibundus? Well, that means an R gene will meet another R gene, hence double R, which means the offsprings will be a Pelophylax Ridibundus, not Esculentus. Okay, but now the question is, what happened when an Esculentus mate with an Esculentus? Wouldn't that be the most intuitive pathway? Well, remember, an Esculentus will always passes down R gene. So if two Esculentus mate, the offspring will always be RR. Hence, Pelophylax Ridibundus, not Esculentus. Though this Ridibundus offspring between two Esculentus is almost always non-viable, so most of them won't reach adulthood. Oh, by the way, that's not the extent of their uniqueness. Male Esculentus is not viable. And why is that? Well, what happened way back when an Esculentus was first produced was most likely a hybridization between a female Ridibundus and a male Lesone. In frogs, females are homozygous, which is the typical XXXY system that a lot of people are familiar with. So the R gene that passes down will always carry X chromosome, which means the Y chromosome can only be obtained from the L gene, but it won't be passed down by an Esculentus, because remember, they only pass down R gene. But still, that's only one system. The second is RE system. So instead of kleptoing from Lesone, they klepto from Ridibundus instead. This happens in a completely different population of course, but this is not a simple reverse from the prior. Instead of only passing down L gene, Esculentus in the system can pass down either L or R gene, but in a skewed ratio, 3:1 to be precise. But still, because they need another species to produce another Esculentus, this is still a klepton population. But now, there is actually another system, the E system, where neither Pelophylax lesoni nor Ridibundus live in that area. This population of Esculentus can persist by mating among themselves. But how? Well, in this population, most females are diploid R, while most males are polyploid. This system also has two different types depending on the population, by the way, but because they reproduce with their own quote-unquote species between Esculentus, this is not kleptogenesis. Hence, these specific populations are technically not klepton. So I wouldn't talk about it too much in this video. We've only been talking about the edible frog. There are two other klepton frogs among this complex, by the way. And in summary, this is how they work, including the specific distribution. So yeah, quite complex, living up to its name I suppose. Okay, but in this case, how could they steal the gamete from another species? Well, frogs are quite famous for their, let's just say, mating frenzy. During breeding season, males can be quite persistent, I suppose. They basically try to mate with anything within a resemblance to frog, even some things that aren't really so. Not only that, most frogs exhibit external fertilization, so when they mate, there is no copulation. This is called amplexus, where male basically just hop onto the female, stimulate the release of eggs, and then fertilize said eggs. Externally, of course, not inside the body of the female. So yeah, mating between two different species is not exactly difficult, because no copulation is needed, albeit not as simple as stealing sperm package like the Ambystoma that I talked about earlier. And then, another quite well-known example would be some Poeciliopsis species complex. This complex involves various unisexual hybridogens of two different species. However, there are two forms of kleptogenesis here. In the first form, the unisexuals are diploid, and during gametogenesis, which is the formation of gamete, the paternal gene is discarded. Hence, it's quite similar to what happened in the Pelophylax complex that I talked about earlier. In the second form though, the unisexuals are triploid, and they need the sperm from another species to stimulate egg division. But the gene from said sperm is not incorporated, hence gynogenesis. So yeah, Poeciliopsis exhibit both hybridogenesis and gynogenesis, in which both are kleptogenesis because they steal sperm from another species. Okay, now, the classic question. How do they steal sperm? Well, in their case, I wouldn't say they steal sperm. Poeciliopsis do produce spermatophores, but the male directly inserts said spermatophore into the female. So even though no copulation happens, they are pretty much mating. The fact that this is how they reproduce raised several questions. You see, species typically mate with its own species. Now the question is, why would a male quote-unquote normal species of Poeciliopsis mate with a hybridogenic all-female one? And not only that, some of these kleptons ecologically compete with the other species that would be their sperm donor. So again, how could they coexist? Well, first of all, the unisexual females would need to mimic the genital patterns of the female from the quote-unquote normal species. Because if they couldn't, then males of that species wouldn't initiate mating. And then the question of, why wouldn't they simply mate with females of their own species? Why could mating between these two different species quote-unquote happen? And quite consistently that is. First explanation, there are too many males. Hence, some males simply don't get a female to mate with. And so, they mate with the klepton. Just an instinct to reproduce, you know. Second explanation, males would like to mate with the rarer type of female. To put it very simply, female of their own species is too common, so they try to mate with the kleptons instead. Sounds pretty human in my opinion, but hey, it is still a possibility, so who knows? There are other examples of kleptons, but mentioning every single one of them would be quite time consuming. And what I would talk about will be kinda samey, so I would rather talk about the problem and limitations surrounding the concept of klepton, because that's more interesting, in my opinion at least. So let's do that. First of all, the most basic question. Why? Why did they become kleptons? What are the evolutionary benefits? Well, like the examples that I talked about earlier, it most likely started with a simple, most likely accidental hybridization. Like I said earlier, most of the time, hybrids won't persist in the wild, but that particular hybrid simply tried to survive. And luckily enough, these ones do have a way to survive. And so they did. And then they simply keep trying to survive, trying to persist in this world, like what an animal, or perhaps all organisms would naturally do. And when they do, when there are enough individuals, enough generations of such creature, then they would be a successful klepton. This might be a lazy explanation, too lazy even, but I simply haven't read a compelling enough hypothesis that makes me go, yeah, that sounds right, or anything like that. For example, I've read a hypothesis stating that being unisexual female is beneficial because they don't have to waste resources and energy to produce male. And I was like, I don't know, man. Having no male sounds impractical as an animal species. Forming clones of yourself usually impair the ability of your species to adapt to changes. You are prone to being wiped out in the case of a disturbance. While yes, some kleptons do form a non-identical offsprings, they still need a donor, a gamete to steal. So if there is nothing to steal from, then you would also perish. That's also one of the paradoxes with kleptons. When you steal a gamete from an established species, that means you reduce the occurrence of reproduction within that established species. Because you are stealing some of the sperms. If there is too much klepton, the population of the species that they stole gamete from would continuously decline. And at some point, or to be more specific, if it reached that point, they might go extinct. And if they do, then you'll also go extinct soon enough because now you cannot reproduce. Nothing to steal from. But yeah, maybe there is simply no evolutionary benefit. It might be the only way for them to survive. And they just hang on to life. Like the famous quote from Ian Malcolm in Jurassic Park. Life, finds a way. But now, I would like to raise another topic for discussion. And actually, I decided to make this video after I watched Supergirl last weekend. So, the main villain is from a unisexual male race or perhaps species, I'm not exactly sure. And that race or that species kidnaps female of other race or maybe other species to reproduce. And yeah, that's not exactly a unique premise. While I couldn't exactly mention any specific title at the moment, I'm pretty sure I've seen quite the exact premise in various popular media. And every time I stumbled upon said premise, I really want to hear about how said race or species become unisexual male. Think about it. Most kleptons that actually exist in our world are unisexual female. But why is that? Why is there no unisexual male klepton? Well, I think it's simply because unisexual male klepton would be too unstable to persist. Having to steal gamete from others to simply persist is already difficult. If you are the female though, that means the offsprings are coming out of you, or at least out of your eggs. Then you have more control of those offsprings. However, if you are the male, then you have less control because you are not the one producing said offsprings. Sure, there are animals that just release their eggs to the wilderness, waiting to stochastically be fertilized by the male gamete, and if you are from that group of animals, then you could klepto those. Release your sperm so you could fertilize those eggs. If your sperm is compatible, that is. Otherwise, the fertilization wouldn't even happen. Or at least, your offsprings wouldn't even be viable and you doom both yourself and your potential host species. But still, even if it's successful, you don't have that much control over your offsprings. It's harder to make sure that they survive. Your supposed offsprings might even be killed by the mother or eaten because it's too different. At least that wouldn't happen if you are the female. And if you think about it, all of those unisexual male species or race in popular media almost always kidnap females to make sure the reproduction actually happen. You couldn't exactly do that naturally in this world. How would a kidnapping even happen in the wild? For such a long time just to make sure the offspring successfully come to life. And if you are a species that regularly do such kidnapping, you would most definitely receive a lot of retaliation. Unless you are the absolute top of the food chain and you are pretty strong, I suppose. But then the question would be, how and why would such species even become unisexual male in the first place? But even if we're gonna disregard that thought, such condition is not feasible for most animals. Sure, some animals with advanced intelligence and advanced technology could perhaps do that, but the only animal that would fit the description, that we know of at least, is basically human. And luckily enough, humans don't need to do that. Actually, I don't even think we could be kleptons even if some humans want to, so yeah. Oh, by the way, the opposite version of gynogenesis do exist, which is androgenesis, where only the male gene is retained. However, I don't think there is any androgen klepton. All of the androgens that I know still reproduce within its own species. Though I definitely don't know everything, so if there is indeed an androgen klepton, do let me know. Discovering klepton is difficult because to make sure it is indeed a klepton, you have to do molecular analysis on them. So yeah, there might be a lot more klepton and we simply didn't realize it. And then, last but definitely not least, is the problems from our perspective, as humans who study them. How would we even place klepton in our systematic biology? Because remember, the concept of biological species. A classic definition of species is a group of animals that could reproduce successfully between each other. So, what about kleptons? Most of them don't fit that description. Well, actually, Dubois, in his original publication that proposed the term klepton and kleptogenesis, also proposed how we should name them. It's pretty similar to how we would write a taxonomic species, but we add KL to the middle, indicating klepton. Oh, by the way, he also proposed we write syn KL, which is syn klepton, to indicate the species which a klepton steals gamete from, but I don't think I've ever seen someone use this, so I suppose it's not popular enough. But still, In this publication, for example, Bogart et al. Stated that the unisexual ambystoma complex is basically too complex for a simple KL annotation, so they used the specific gene combination instead. All in all, these kinds of rules and systems are man-made. It's our effort to systematically study organisms that would represent how they are naturally. Of course, it's not perfect. It'll most likely never reach perfection, actually. But hey, as we discover new things, we could improve biology as a concept and as a system. Right now, we are at a state where a lot of our supposedly established concepts just have too much of an exception, and it becomes confusing. But with more discoveries and understanding, I'm sure we will sort things out. Well, some of them at least. For now, let's just do our best to learn what is known. And that's all for now. Oh, by the way, the usage of the term kleptogenesis and klepton might even vary from authors to authors, so you should try to understand the general concept rather than hyper-focusing on one article. Anyway, enjoy your day.